What's up, guys? Welcome back to the video series based on my book, What Happens When You're Generous. So in video session 1, we talked about how our heart changes. Talked about how God doesn't want our money, He wants our heart. He doesn't just want us to do these good deeds or to donate money, but it's really about the heart that's behind it. In session 2, we talked about how our situation changes. And when you're generous and your heart changes, then your situation is going to change. Now, for some people, their situation, it changes like quickly. But for most of us, if you're like me, it's more of a gradual thing. And I think a lot of times we don't even notice how our situation has changed and how God's blessed us because we're just in the middle of life. And it's kind of this gradual thing. But it's really good that on a regular basis, if we can pause and we can kind of look back and reflect and see like where God has brought us from and how there's been blessings on the journey. And there's been ups and downs, but to see how far we've actually come. I think if we do that more often, we'd be a lot more grateful, a lot more thankful. So we talked about our heart changes, our situation changes. Today we're gonna zoom in on chapter 3. And we're gonna talk about how our church changes. Now, I've been at Crossover Church now for 24 years. It's crazy. That's over half of my life. So you can imagine me being here for that long. There's been a lot of changes. There's been a lot of things that have happened over the years. Good stuff, ups and downs, but I mean, there's a story, and I share a lot of the story in chapter 3. But today in this video, I want to peel back a couple other layers and go a little bit deeper and share a little bit. See, when I first became the pastor in 2002, there was just a small handful of hearts, and they were young hearts. God bless their hearts. I was one of those young hearts, just really starting out in ministry. And a lot of times when we're just starting out, God uses humble situations, humble beginnings, so He can shape our heart and He can make it into something amazing. And so even back then, when we just had a small handful of hearts, you know what? Crossover had generous hearts. We did. And people gave, especially of their time and their talent. And we watched God show up and do amazing things. And so our church began to change. Our situation changed. Why? Because people were generous. We began to grow. So the average church in America has about 75 to 80 people. And Crossover, when I first became the pastor, had actually less than that. But quickly, as people were generous and we began to just pour back into our community and do things differently, the church began to grow. And before you knew it, we had hundreds of people coming to multiple services. Now, I can say this, and I think you've noticed this, Crossover has never been your average church because we've always done things so differently. We've always been out of the box. I mean, I can think all the way back to 1998. That's when we started using a DJ in worship. You know, some of you guys, when you first came to Crossover, or if you've never been, you'd see a DJ up on the stage. You'd be like, what? They got a DJ. We've been doing that now for like a long time, right? I think we were one of the first churches in the world, if not the first, to start using a DJ in worship. And so we had graffiti covered our vans. That was before we even knew about like vehicle wraps. We had our own wraps, for real. We had rap concerts, we had outreach concerts. We did all kinds of things that, especially at that time, churches weren't doing. So we took our creativity, our gifts, our talent, our time, and people were generous with those things. Now, one of the things was, due to God's generosity and some other believers, the former church campus we had was actually given to us, but it was an old building and it was very run down. But miraculously, because people were generous, all those young, generous hearts at the old campus, you know what, we were able to completely remodel that campus. And almost all the work was done by people from our church that donated their time and did it for free. So we put in like all new electrical, we put in a lot of new lighting, new audio visual, we painted everything like multiple times inside and out, put new roofs on. I mean, there's just so many different things that we did at that campus. We built a skate park, we built almost 5,000 square feet of patio space outside of the building in the front and the back to create more room. And the reason we did that was because we wanted to reach more people and we wanted to do things in excellence. We wanted it to be nice. I think sometimes in the urban community, we can kind of just like squeeze by, we'll just like do enough. We've always been pushing back against that since day one, saying, listen, if this is for God, we should be doing it in excellence. So we've always been about excellence and about raising the bar. And so people noticed that. In 2008 to 2010, Crossover radically changed. But in 2010 was the biggest change we ever had yet. That's when we relocated from the old campus behind Lowry Park Zoo area to the new building that I'm standing in right now, the former Toys R Us store. So we went from about 6,000 square feet of indoor space to 43,000 square foot of indoor space. And so we were cramped at the old spot. We didn't have enough room. We were like packed in like sardines. But here we came into this building and it's just been an amazing space. We got this huge kids wing. We got a gymnasium. We got a classroom wing. We got a huge lobby. We got plenty of parking. We got an auditorium that is like can seat 4 times the amount of people that our old one could. And so we're like super blessed. How are we able to do that? To now be in this space, and we've seen thousands of people come to Jesus. Over 1,500 people have been baptized since we've been in this space. How are we able to get here? Because people were generous. People were radically generous, and the situation of Crossover Church, it radically changed over the last number of years. But you know what? We all know that that's not the story of every church. And I'm not saying that our church is better than anyone else, or we're more deserving, or we're more blessed, anything like that. Just stating the truth that a lot of churches don't see growth like this. And I'm humbled and grateful and honored to be a part of it for these 24 years. Now, there's a lot of reasons that churches don't grow, but I believe that one of the reasons is people don't learn how to be more generous with their time, their talent, and their treasure. And when people don't become more generous, the church eventually becomes stagnant, and then it begins to decline. And every year there's thousands of churches that close their doors. And the majority of churches in the United States right now are plateaued, or they're even in the decline. So we need to pray. We need to pray that God's people will rise up. One of my favorite books in the Bible is Nehemiah. A couple years ago, I got to write a book called Rebuild. And it talked about how we rebuilt the Toys R Us store and the miracle story behind that, gave people tools to rebuild their lives and their families. But it also was based on the book of Nehemiah. And that was the underlying biblical thread throughout the book. We actually did some videos right here on my YouTube channel if you want to watch that series next. If you're looking for something to watch, it's a great series you can check out. But Nehemiah, the story is so much known for he came in miraculously and rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in just 52 days. And so that's like the exciting, sexy part of it. Wow, he did this. But many times people don't read the rest of the story. Because that's the first couple chapters of Nehemiah. They can think like he built the walls and then he bounced. No, he actually stayed for many more years, because it took a lot more than 52 days to rebuild people, not just the walls physically, but the people now, to rebuild them spiritually, emotionally, even to rebuild the economy. And he stayed there, and God did miraculous stuff. If you read the rest of Nehemiah, got to the point to where the king that sent him there to rebuild wanted him to come back. He missed him. He said, man, I need you to come back. So Nehemiah kind of set everything in place, and everything was pretty stable. And then he headed back to Babylon. Well, he came back again to Jerusalem after a little while. When he came back, he was shocked to see what he saw. Now, scholars say that he was gone for about 2 years, but in those 2 years, man, things went downhill real quick. People's generosity dried up and leaders compromised. And so if we look in the scripture, some of that story that happens was there was one of the priests in the temple that actually let one of his relatives move in to the temple in one of the rooms. And it was actually the room where people's tithes and offerings of their grain and their oils was stored. So they moved all that stuff out, and they moved this dude, and they like hooked him up with a private room in there or something. But on top of all that, that wasn't cool. But on top of that, the guy that they moved in, his name was Tobiah. Now, if you have ever read Nehemiah, Tobiah was one of the characters earlier in the book of Nehemiah when they were trying to rebuild the walls. He was one of the guys that was against the rebuilding. And he was lying and deceiving Nehemiah, trying to, and sending him threatening letters, and he was trying to cause drama and beef and static. It was crazy. Now, so this is the dude that was against all this, and now they move him in the temple when Nehemiah's gone. It's like a slap in the face, right? So Nehemiah shows up, and here's what it says in verse 10. Nehemiah says, he talked about all that, and then he said, I also discovered that the Levites had not been given their prescribed portions of food. And so they and the singers who were to conduct worship services at the church, they had all returned to their fields. So Nehemiah said this, he said, I confronted the leaders and I demanded, Nehemiah was tough, y'all. He said, why has the temple of God been neglected? Why has the church been neglected? Then I called all the Levites back again and restored them to their proper duties. And once again, all the people of Judah began bringing their tithes of grain and new wine and olive oil to the temple storerooms. So basically the people stopped being generous. They stopped even attending church and bringing their tithes. And so the staff at the church, the pastors, the leaders there, they all had to go and get regular jobs. And then basically there was no worship services even happening. So in essence, the church just closed its doors. It shut down. So Nehemiah came back and he's like, hold on. So he restored everything, got everything back on point, and was like, wow. But you know what? That's the story of many churches. When people's generosity dries up and people begin to compromise their impact for God's kingdom and God's work, it begins to dry up and eventually it can stop. So, you know what? I'm grateful to be part of a church family that's generous. And like it talks about in the beginning of chapter 3, I'm grateful to be part of a church that has integrity and has good processes in place when it comes to finances. If you haven't read chapter 3, you can read some of the details of how our church puts things in place with systems and people and checkpoints to make sure that we maximize every dollar. And we have a CPA that overlooks everything. And so nothing funny can happen with the money. You can be confident when you're giving to Crossover Church, to your church. And so, you know what? Our church has been faithful with little, and God's blessed us with a little more. We've been faithful with that, God's blessed us with a little more, and then a little more. And so it's really kind of that Matthew chapter 25 principle. That's really our story at Crossover Church. Since I took over in 2002, our budget is actually over 20 times larger than it was the first year when I started. I mean, that's amazing. I would have never dreamt or imagined that our generosity level would grow to where it's at. And that's helped us to be more generous and to love our city more than we ever have before. And so listen, y'all, I believe that the greatest days are ahead for our church and for the church as a whole as God's people rise up and as God's people become more generous. Then you know what happens? That's chapter 4. That's the last chapter. That's the last video session. Then our city changes. So our heart changes, our situation changes, our church changes, then our city changes. So go ahead and read chapter 4, check out the discussion questions, and I'll see you on the last session. Hey, may God bless your church.